Peoples Speak. I am Regine Jessica Abuel, your host for this podcast. For today's episode, we will be covering a new and interesting topic with the help of our guests who are both women's activists and leaders from ASEAN. We have, for our first guest, a Filipina educator who is currently the Senior Project Director of the Women and Gender Institute, or WAGI, at Miriam College, an all-girls educational institution in Quezon City, Philippines. WAGI is a specialized center that has been running for more than 20 years and focuses on research and training and advocates for women's rights, gender equality, and non-sexist learning in support of the leadership of young women and students. Our first guest focuses her work on gender, peace and security, migration, and women's human rights. In 2010 to 2015, she was the Philippine representative for women's rights to the ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children. She was elected as one of the experts in the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, where she became a rapporteur. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our first guest for tonight, Professor Aurora Javate-De Dios, or Professor Oyi. Hello, welcome to the show tonight.
Good evening,
Good
and
evening,
thank you for the
Professor.
invite.
You are most welcome, ma'am. And we are happy that we're able to see you, and we are honored by your presence. And for our second guest, she is the Executive Director of Women's Aid Organization. The Women's Aid Organization is a Malaysian non-government organization that provides free shelter, counseling, and crisis support to women and children who experience abuse. It is also an NGO that focuses on advocacy, law reform, and public awareness for eliminating discrimination and gender equality. Before becoming the executive director of Women's Aid Organization, our second guest worked for over 15 years with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, in various capacities, including working in refugee protection areas, as Senior Protection Officer in UNHCR in Hong Kong, Indonesia, Turkey, Geneva, and Libya. Her last posting was in Baghdad, where she was the Senior Project Management Officer of a field-based operation that placed her in the middle of the Iraqi insurgency. Wow! Without further ado, let's welcome our second guest, Ms. Sumitra Visvanathan. Yay! Hello, Sumitra. Good
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you also for gracing this occasion. We're very much honored to meet you, Professor Oyi, and Miss Sumitra, or Sumitra, if I may call you. All right. So thank you. First of all, thank you for tonight, and we'll start off with, since we're going to talk about women and gender equality, I'd like to ask you. Can you share with us your experience, or how is it like growing up as a girl or as a woman in your country, especially considering that you came from countries that are predominantly conservative in a way? Like, for example, Professor Oyi, Philippines is a predominantly Catholic country, and Sumitra is from Malaysia, and it's predominantly Muslim. Anybody? Maybe Professor Oyi can start?
Okay, yes. Thank you for that question. I've not thought of being a Catholic for a long while. Yes, you could say that we probably share, 90% of Filipinos share a common background in that we all grew up in a home that is very, very Catholic. Mine is no exception. My grandmother used to go to church almost every day. And then Sunday was a ritual for everybody. It's a family event. You have to go to mass, holidays, and holiday days of religious days of obligation. all these saints that have endless birthdays, and then during Lent as well as Christmas. Those are all Catholicism is so ritual centered, no? And
Mm-hmm.
whether you are 5 years old or 10 years old, an adult, you have to go to mass. And we were told that not to go to mass will be a sin, no? Even if we didn't understand what a sin was, no, as early as I said, your childhood, and that has been reinforced by our education, which is also a lot of our universities, colleges, and particularly in towns and the provinces, are predominantly controlled by the Catholic Church. We have about 3,000 colleges and universities, Catholic privately and Catholic owned, according to the Catholic Educators Association of the Philippines. Now, given that background, one can't really escape, certain norms and standards that are expected of you, and is, the substance of your upbringing, as a girl and as a boy. One, it's a mix of culture as well as religion, because religion teaches you to believe in one God, observe all these religious rituals, and don't uh, do certain things that are bad for you, and for you spirituality. I remember our retreat master. During our retreat, we have things like spiritual retreat, um, even during elementary and high school. So that was all the reinforcement you get as a Catholic. And by the time you finish high school, you firmly believe these things, no? Now, the other aspect of being a Catholic are, the messages, no? Either verbally articulated by your parents, or, the kind of practice that they do on an everyday basis. And so that was it. Religion teaches you that as a girl, as a woman, you can't do certain things, and certain things are bad for you, really, really bad, particularly on sexuality. No, so that's the first lesson that I learned. Never even think about it. The second, of course, reinforcement are the socialization that you get from your parents, and your parents would also say, "Don't do this because you're going to. That is not the proper, way lady should be acting or behaving, like, and then as early as 9 years old, I think, because, by the way, we're all girls, no, seven, and my brother came much, much later. He was the youngest. My grandmother would teach us all to cook at age 9. And because you still are enjoying your childhood, and I don't want to cook, to have to observe her. And the only reason that she would tell us, you have to learn how to cook because you're going to be a wife, no, and that's it, no, and no, you cannot go outside. You cannot play as you please. There's and go home before dark and things like that. Things that they are not really explained to you. So I grew up in that environment, and do not talk back to your parents. No, you're told to be quiet, because
Quiet.
if you're noisy, then you are unladylike. So those kinds of things, and I think there's nothing really particularly Catholic about that, the socialization that you get, but it's very much influenced by the religious rituals, as well as the gospel is that are that people believe, particularly the elders. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can follow up so Sunita can
Yes.
talk about her experience.
How about
Yeah.
Sumitra?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's such a wonderful explanation of all the different forces. And I would say that in Malaysia, actually, even it's predominantly Muslim, but the experience actually is social experience is not that much difference. And I think it's so important. Some of the things that you said is so important. Religion and culture, standards and norms of expected social behavior, and then also the socialization that we get from our families. So Malaysia actually is predominantly Muslim, but it's also very diverse. So, for instance, I'm Hindu. I was born Hindu. I'm still a practicing Hindu, but I live within a Muslim society. So our constitution actually guarantees that freedom of religion and freedom of belief. But again, to draw attention to that whole thing of the religion, the culture, and how it then establishes the standards and norms for acceptable behavior. I think that was very much permeated throughout society when I grew up. I mean, in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was a child, absolutely, that was the experience. And then also very clear and defined gender roles, and also very much putting a damper on sexuality, and especially women's sexuality, and trying very hard to control women through sexuality and and
Roles, I
reproductive
guess.
rights and so
Yes.
forth. Yeah, but for me, in terms of family socialization, I think I was very lucky because my parents embraced everything. They embraced all religions and all cultures, and we were very much encouraged to speak up, to even speak up and voice opinions against what they were trying to get us to do. So my parents were very open-minded in that way. We were taken to church, we were taken to temple, Buddhist temple, we went everywhere because my mother had a fundamental belief in faith of a higher order. So yeah, so that happened. But also what I learned in terms of socialization is that as a girl, I need to always make sure that I have an education, that I have my own bank account, that I have a job,
Yes.
and that I own my own home. So that was
Wonderful.
drilled into my head as something that's very important, and I think it kind of shaped me who I am now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sumitra, for
Yeah.
that. I like the fact that you were able to also just tell us how society has actually given a certain stereotype to women, yet you were raised also in that kind of environment where
Yeah.
your parents especially are very encouraging and are very open. That's why you grew up also just being sensitive also to others and being more independent as a woman. But can you give us concrete examples or maybe instances where you felt like certain expectations became hindrances in your life, though? I mean,
Okay.
even if you've shared with us, for example, instances where you have tried to break the norm or those stereotypes for women or expectations coming from you, were there instances when you had to take these as hindrances, and then how were you able to break that glass ceiling or that kind of expectation?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I was not a particularly rebellious person because, you're
Yes.
expected to obey and,
Mhm.
but even if these were expectations of my parents and my father, the reality around me, was telling me another message. Why? Because we're all women. We're six girls, and we were seventh, but one of us died as a baby.
Mhm.
So I was, and then my mother and my grandmother stayed with us. My father came only during because he was assigned somewhere else, so he would drop by the house every weekend. So the reality that I saw were, I saw my mother and we were independent. No, they were independent. They were earning their living. My mother was a pharmacist, and he was, I think he subscribed, and with a lot of, this Time magazine, Newsweek magazine, all kinds of, foreign and newspapers and all of that. She was a distributor of that, and so I had, the luxury at an early age to read all kinds of things that and that's how I learned about a little bit about sexuality, about girl boy relationship, and that opened to me a very very exciting world, no, the reading. And then the other thing was that also the reality that I said was I was surrounded by very strong women, who were independent, hardworking, who are survivors, and my siblings are all, because they're also the same like me. We grew up not restricted, but very much behaved. But we knew what to do. We knew cooking, we knew cleaning, we do laundry and everything, no, in a very systematic way. So these are life skills, no. I realized that these are not really for women and men, because once my brother was born, he was exempted from all of this, no, and because of that, he was the weaker, no, and all these kinds of things that you do on a daily basis builds up your personality and your confidence. So after high school was a reinforcement of my Catholic upbringing. I didn't see any difference, and in fact, it was reinforced. But then I got very curious about studying somewhere else, and I said, "This is getting to be very boring with the same." So when it was the time to choose my college, we went to UP, no? And UP at the time was the cradle of communism, no? So it was all this red baiting
So
that was
just
going on.
for
So
context,
I
UP is a state university, correct?
State
Yes,
University, the
yes.
biggest university and the most at that time probably most radical.
Radical.
And my grandmother was warning me, don't you ever enroll in that university because you'll become a communist. And I said, wow, how exciting. No, the more she warned me about it, the more I wanted to go to this school. And I did. And that was so liberating for me, because then I became, oh, this is the real world. So that got me into thinking that all of these things that I learned about religion were really just, something that you have to learn as part of your accumulation of knowledge. But that was not the universe, and that was not even partial truth, no. So there are other things you have to learn about this life, and part of that is also understanding yourself in relation to other people, in relation to the other genders, and that you are free to do as you please. Those were big discoveries for me when I went to college.
Oh, interesting. So that was kind of the turning point then of
Yeah.
your view on certain things, especially when it comes to the way that you were raised. How about you, Sumitra, growing up?
Yeah, so reflecting, and I would say similar to Professor Hoy, actually, it was when so growing up, maybe not so much from my own family, but certainly from the wider society, all these gender roles being assigned to us, and always being made to feel like somehow you're lesser than the boy in school, within the neighborhood, and in the extended family, and in our culture, there's somehow is this perception that the boys will eat first and then the girls. So whenever there was like communal, like a wedding or whatever, the men eat first. And I remember one time when and that's not how we were brought up at home. So one time when my sister and I were queuing up for food, and an auntie came over and said, "Don't you know the boys have to eat first?" And then my sister turned to her and said, "That's not what my mummy said." And so that's just an example of how these little things kind of like keep cutting you down and cutting down on your self-worth. And really, it's only when I went to university and covered feminism, and suddenly everything makes sense. Everything made sense, and a path actually became clear to me. I know what life should be like, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that that becomes life. So yeah.
You know what I noticed also? Turning.
Yes.
What I noticed, first thing I noticed, just like Sumitra, when I went to the classroom, the boys were so confident. So they would speak first and recite first and they're not afraid to articulate with the very confident voice. Whereas the girls would, kind of stay in the middle or the last rows and would not speak until the boys speak first. I guess it's a self control. You don't want to be criticized for being too aggressive. And I said, why is that? No, so I was wondering, and even in high school, I did not encounter that, but in college, I did. Even in UP, and they said, why are you always staying in front of the? Whenever I had a class, I would stay in front. And they said,
Mm.
wow, she's so confident. No, and, but then I said, it was not confidence at all. It was because when you sit right in front, you will not be in the trajectory of the professor because she will call
Mhm.
those in the middle, in the last. That was all a strategy
Yeah.
for me not to be called in recitation. But then I said, why are they all
Yeah.
sitting up? So
That's
I was
very that's
always,
very interesting. That's a very interesting experience, Professor Oya. But
it was not because I was intelligent or anything like that.
yeah, it was more of a strategy for you as a student then. But moving forward now to how it is now, given the modern times and how you grew up, I'd like to ask you if you would compare your experiences back then. Is there a difference as to how women are raised now? And I'd like to ask your opinion. If there is, then what do you think is the as a main contributor to that kind of change, and why? Or if there's none, then why as well?
Yeah, so I feel that the you know the perceptions and so forth are still very much rooted
Mm-hmm.
in society, and the perceptions of the differences, the gender inequality, and so forth. It's still very much rooted. But however, I feel that spaces and platforms are emerging
Mm-hmm.
that actually are giving women, young women, girls, more of a voice. And
Mm.
actually, that's within social media. And I think the challenge for us, also for those of us who are activists, governments as well, is to do more to keep those emerging spaces safe for women and girls. Because along with the opportunity to speak up, to use those platforms, to articulate and share views, along with that, it's also the emergence of online abuse and
Mm.
shutting,
Yeah.
women down and so forth. But in the way that girls are being raised, WAO recently did a survey, and it's a survey on public attitudes and perceptions of violence against women. And the results of that survey were actually quite worrying because it
Mm-hmm.
showed that there's a lot of, like within the public psyche, even though the public is able to recognize violence against women when it happens, what is actually domestic violence, they know. But still, there's a lot of victim blaming. There's a lot of perception still that it's a family issue. They don't link violence against women with inequality, with gender inequality, and so forth. So public attitudes and perceptions around equality and equality for women and gender equality, I don't think that they have shifted forward in a positive way,
Mm-hmm.
in a in a appreciably different way. That's my feeling. Professor Oye, I don't know what you feel about this.
How about
Yeah,
you, Professor Oyi?
yeah. Then and now, I think there's tremendous difference. Just looking at the schools, for example, in UP, the only college and university that is open to women, the first college that was opened was the College of Education. You
Mm-hmm.
may not enroll in the College of Law, the College of Engineering, the College of Medicine, and it was never explained why women were excluded. And then when they were included, I'm just giving the example of UP, and this goes for Ateneo as well as LaSalle. the big
Just for
Catholic.
yes, just for context, these are Catholic universities here in the Philippines. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And when they finally opened the doors for College of Medicine, for instance, in UP, women were required to have a higher grade average upon entrance compared to men. So, for example,
Mm.
women will be, required to have 1.1, which is almost like perfect score, compared to, any grade or for men. It's the same with Ateneo. Not long ago, that was, there was a difference in terms of admission. So women have to be doubly more intelligent than men to be admitted to be even at par with the regular boys. So I thought, what was that about? And But slowly that changed, just in terms of this very concrete example of admissions. Then, of course, as I said, all the major clubs and associations in the city were all dominated by men and only for men, So
Mm.
Mhm.
Lions Club, as well as, all kinds of these exclusive clubs are all for men. And little by little, this was chipped away. These were questioned and they were challenged by women over time, And I think that took about maybe education was opened, universal education during the American period. And about 50 years, women had been able to get the right to vote. And then little by little, they questioned all these unequal, social practices because their practices, they're not written in stone. And now what we have is, um, because then we didn't have any women's movement to fight collectively for women's rights. And that is a very important factor. Now, with the emergence of, movements, first, there were political movements, but in the political movements themselves are unequal practices, like the leadership is very much dominated by men, and women were relegated to mixing coffee and serving the male leaders. I remember that but I never, me as a student, after, and especially when I got involved in activism, I never wanted to do that for anyone. So I was also always debating, I was fighting, and uh, during martial law, before martial law, there was no one else because the guys were all arrested. So
So you
I
had
was,
to step up. You had to step up, Professor
yeah,
Oyi. Yeah.
by accident. No, although
By,
I was determined to prove to them that, I can do whatever it takes. I was never really eager to be a leader because to be a leader in the time of repression is very dangerous. But I had no choice because no one else wanted to come in because all the guys were either in China or were arrested in the Philippines. So by accident, I was forced to become a leader.
a leader.
But yeah, so it was. I think all these male-centered practices were eroded, not because you had one or two women who fought for it, but you had a collective, the power of women slowly emerging first by joining, big political movements, and then realizing that within those movements there's discrimination and that women have had to assert their independence from the movements themselves and create their own movement. So I think that's what happened in the Philippines and probably also in other countries like Malaysia. So I think that's this happened during the anti-Vietnam War, no? During when student movements around the world were emerging.
So moving now to, since Professor Oyi already mentioned it, that there has been a change then, or a shift in terms of women and then gender equality. I'd like to ask you now, in your opinion, then, what are the major developments in women's rights in ASEAN today? And likewise, do you think they have remained the same, or are there any emerging issues of women's rights in ASEAN throughout the years? And if ever, does the ASEAN as a regional body help address these issues?
So my expertise is in Malaysia, but obviously I have an appreciable understanding of ASEAN,
Yes,
the
yes.
wider canvas. So what I feel is so critically important right now is needing to look at opportunities and building on them, but
Mm.
also needing to understand what the baseline is. So I think one of the most critically important issues that ASEAN really needs to address is this issue of women's labor,
Mm.
women's migrant labor, and not only the drivers of women's labor migration, but also the treatment of women migrant workers when they are in host countries, which are all ASEAN countries, because a lot of that movement happens within ASEAN. And then related to that, also that issue of trafficking of women
Mhm.
and trafficking of girls across borders in ASEAN, the protections that are afforded to survivors of trafficking, which is one of the forms of violence against women, is it really needs to be stepped up through very, very concrete cross boundary action
Action.
rather than
Action.
having it just focused as a bilateral initiative, if at all. So that's the movement, the labor movements, and the protections that are afforded to women migrant workers. The other thing also is about trafficking, and then the third thing is refugee movements. And I
Mm.
think it's important to recognize that within ASEAN there are both source countries of refugees and receiving countries of refugees, and within that, refugee women, of course, experience a lot of intersecting challenges and discriminations and abuses. So I feel that what is critically needed at the ASEAN level is recognizing that we have these challenges, and
Mhm.
also to leverage on the institutions that are currently in place to ensure that they are being more inclusive, that they are being broadly accepting of all of these various issues. So I know, Professor, that you do a lot of work around the issue of women's peace and security, migration, human rights, etc. So I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on this. So, and also the other thing that I want to raise is that whole ASEAN Economic Community. And I think
Mhm.
ASEAN Economic Community is a very, very important and potentially powerful platform to push
Mhm.
forward positive social change, including towards gender equality. Because adopting gender equality within ASEAN as a key goal of the AEC is so important, and the need to take that transformative equality approach that ASEAN as a community sets standards, adopts international standards, and works towards not just structure, not just substantive change, not just structural change, but very importantly, cultural change within ASEAN,
Cultural
and
change.
using gender equality as a driver to create that sense of community within ASEAN,
Mhm.
including leveraging on the AAC, I feel is so important right now. We can
I
make
like.
change.
Yeah, I like that that you pointed that out. It's that having it's having that sense of community, of inclusiveness that we have to promote. It's one thing, of course, to have laws or to have declarations or conventions or talks, but at the end of the day, people have to feel that they are part of a community. They're part of a culture that is inclusive and sensitive when it comes to gender and also even gender orientation. So that's a very good point that you actually just said a while ago, Sumitra. Thank you for that. How about you, Professor Oyi?
Yeah, I like having visited all 10 countries in ASEAN because of my work
Mm.
in ACWC. I'd like to talk a bit about some of the highlights of the achievement of ASEAN. I think ASEAN has not been engaged in the issue of gender equality until lately, maybe the
Okay. Yeah.
last 10 years. But before that, it was all security, anti-communism, and all that. But now I think it is much more attuned to, to the necessity of
The
observing
changing
international
times.
changing times,
Yeah.
adopting caring and sharing community for one. No, it's such a loaded term. What I've noticed is, and we went around the universities, and I think one of the best things that have happened in the last 20, 30 years in ASEAN is that women's education have really, increased, and they have, just in terms of getting more girls and women in school, no, and
Mm. Yeah.
increasing the
Yes.
literacy rate. I think that's the most visible improvement that we see. We see as well, the a little, not a significant change in terms of women's employment and work, because there's a lot of inequality there, no, and of course, added to that is the fact that women are going out in migration for themselves and for their family, uh, on their own. Before they had to tag along with their husbands, and that's raising the issue of feminization of migration, and women becoming the economic bearers of the
Providers.
financial burden
Yes.
the
Yes.
family. So they're earning a lot. And the third is, of course, the awareness and violence against women. ASEAN is quite late in recognizing that, but nevertheless, it has taken up that issue. And when I was in ACWC, one of the things that we did was to do a human rights review of all ASEAN,
Mm.
10 ASEAN countries from the perspective of women's human rights, including violence against women. So just the recognition, no, that's to me that is a significant thing.
Mhm.
And then the fourth is, of course, and this is coming in very slow, is the recognition that conflict, the issues of gender, peace, and security should be prioritized, no, should be at the center of economic development, alongside economic development and everything else. But this is something that the states, are very reluctant to recognize.
To
Now,
recognize.
having said some of this, the drawback is that in all of these areas, we have, some issues. Education, of course, is there's still discrimination, and whilst women are advancing in education, they are retrogressing in terms of work and employment, because they're still unequal in terms of the hiring practices, employment practices, and a lot of sexual harassment in at work has not been recognized by all 10 countries. Only a few countries have done so in ASEAN. Violence against women, trafficking is recognized. In fact, we did, I think, guidelines on trafficking, as well as not sexual harassment, but rape and violence against children. That those are some of the big issues. But they have not taken seriously the technology-driven violence against women, which is a
Mm.
central feature of violence that is new and
Which
emerging.
was which was also mentioned by Sumitra a while ago,
Mhm, mhm.
with the drive of social media, cyberspace, internet.
And on the issue of gender, peace, and security, only two countries, I think, Philippines and Indonesia, have the national action plans on UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which is a very poor record, given that ASEAN is a conflict-ridden region. There's
Mhm.
very slow recognition nor acknowledgement that this is a real issue in countries like Cambodia, in countries like Myanmar, and even in the Philippines. So you have here a mix of some gains, but a lot more problems. A lot more. The saving grace of the people's movement, as well as the feminist movement, which has really engaged states, on these issues, And even without platform, they created their own platforms, like on Alternative
Yeah.
ASEAN Dialogue, to question the states about not only their inefficiency, but also their reluctance to recognize these issues as interrelated. The economics are interrelated with the political, and it is related with the cultural, to address, to make ASEAN the economic promise that it wants to project uh, of the 21st century, then it must do so in a way that solves this, that really seriously addresses these problems and not just give lip service to them. At the moment, still lip service. I can tell you that. And most
I
of the
agree. I agree.
meetings are, pardon the expression, but no more than a debating club. No,
Mm.
you do not get things done because the states are so reluctant or even won't budge about the issues that they are against.
Professor Oyi, thank you for that. You have given us very insightful points that not just in this country, but as ASEAN as a whole. I've noticed that you've given us different aspects, not just in terms of, I mean, not just in terms of like women and gender equality, but also in violence. And I like the fact that you also pointed out that it's not supposed to be just lip service. Everything has to be put into action, and states have to make concrete plans, not just plans, but action plans regarding these emerging issues. Thank you for that, Professor Oyi. And we've actually learned a lot from you, considering that you were the former Philippine representative of the ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children, or as you have mentioned a while ago, ACWC. So thank you for that. And I've definitely learned a lot. I'd like to ask you, though, on a personal level, if I may, considering that we've talked about issues already, how you've grown, your experiences, the expectations coming from you, and how you've managed them, and maybe also broke expectations given by society. This is actually something to get to know you more. If you could pick a superhero, a book character, or a personality in a movie or a series that could best describe you as a woman, who would it be and why?
First of all, the women that I admire. No, can
Mhm.
I start with that?
Yes,
I
definitely.
particularly admire the suffragists everywhere, no, and
Mhm.
particularly the suffragists in the Philippines.
Mhm.
That really, I think paved the way for women's right to vote. That was so important because at that time the Philippine Assembly do not want to give the women the right to vote because they think that they're not ready for it. No, it's beyond their ken. But these women, known as the suffragists, work hard to get at least I think the requirement was 200,000 signatures. And this was like 1935. And because there were no internet, there were no telephones were rare at that time. So they had to ride the banca, bus, and probably Kalesa, ride the Carabao driven cart, and things like that across the country to get this almost 300,000 votes. No, and that was the only time it was they were granted the right to vote. Next is not a Filipina, but Rosa Luxemburg. I am sure you don't know her. She's a
Mm.
Marxist thinker. She's a German. People would equate her in terms of the intellectual capacity with Lenin, because she wrote The Accumulation of Capital. She had a PhD when women were still not in the universities. And she challenged the other socialists for their backward thinking that led to the ascendancy of Hitler. And for that, she was kidnapped and was tortured and was thrown into the river.
Mhm.
I'm supposed to do a paper on her. The other is Japanese, the writer Yayori Matsui. Yayori
Mhm.
Matsui is a journalist who had to disguise her name as a male writer before she could be accepted. And she was such a good writer that she became the highest paid journalist of Asahi Shimbun. And one of the things that she did was path breaking. And this was to expose the comfort women issue. And she led the 3-year campaign to have the Japan's military tribunal in Tokyo, of which I was a part. No, Miriam College was a part.
Oh.
Yes, he
Oh.
did document research on the Philippines, and it was like 300 of us who did the research in different countries, including Singapore, Indonesia, Holland. And if I were to choose my cartoon character ba yun?
Or
Not cartoon,
anybody that
anybody.
yeah.
I wanted to choose Wonder Woman, but I said, "Oh my
Mm.
goodness, I think it's more the you if you are a guy, your attention will be divided between her,
It-
bodily attributes and her
yeah.
strength, and I don't want that. So I want
Mm.
probably uh, somebody who's with the Avengers, no? Because it's a
Ah,
more
Perfect.
yes, yes, and we go after all this rapists and
yes, yes, yes.
but
Oh,
also
I like
Aba.
that. I like that. Thank you, Professor Oyi. I like that you would want to become an Avenger.
If I
So we
could
all know that you
please.
like Marvel more than DC.
I wish I was younger to be able to do that. Sumitra, you need young people like Sumitra to do that.
No, but
I'm not that young.
we equally need you and Sumitra in our society now. How about you, Sumitra? Anything else that you anybody that you would like to share with us? Also,
Yeah.
maybe also if any person that you also look up to, since Professor Oyi also shared with us a while ago the icons or people that she looked up to be as well.
So the one icon that I've had ever since I was a child was Eleanor Roosevelt. Um,
Mm,
and yeah,
yes.
so because of all her work around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also I just loved the things that she said, which really struck
Mm,
a chord with me. And one of the things that she said is do that one thing that you are most afraid of.
mm,
And I think that's really great advice, because usually the
yeah.
things that you're afraid of is something that you don't know, so you fear the unknown. And it's when you do it that you realize, oh, I can do that after all. So definitely her. Then the second one is a woman called Sibyl Kartigesu,
Mm,
who was a Malaysian woman, and she was sort of during the Japanese occupation. She was someone who was very active in providing support to the resistance, the
mm,
Malayan resistance, which eventually became, which started off as the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, but eventually became the Communist Party in Malaya. But
mm,
for her, it was all before that, and she was arrested by the Japanese, and she was tortured, and she suffered physical illnesses that eventually led to her death. But also, it's
mm,
something that I feel very poignant is all of her contributions were forgotten or not acknowledged because she was seen as a communist. And
mm.
so actually she's never truly been acknowledged for that great warrior woman, you
Until
know,
today? Until this day?
until today, yeah.
Oh.
So there is a book and there's a movie that has just come out about her life, which is really a really good movie. And
What's the
so
movie? Tell us then so that we could watch it.
yeah, I think it's called Sibyl, and the movie is
Sibyl.
just called Sibyl.
Sibyl.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you can find it on YouTube, but yeah,
Or
it's
we
a,
can wait. We can wait eventually until they release it on Netflix or or some other platform. Yes, but that's
so
very interesting.
yeah. So for the fictional character, I had to think long and hard, and for me, it's Daenerys Targaryen, and the mother of dragons.
Oh,
And the
yes,
reason
the
for
Mother of
that,
Dragons.
because she started out as someone who was abused by her brother, forced into marriage, taken to a foreign country, of not of her choosing, and she stood up to all of that. And she's a survivor, whatever she subsequently became. But she's the survivor. She's someone who overcame all of the obstacles and ended up being like, a queen.
Yes,
So,
I agree. I
Mother of
agree.
Dragons. That's
Mother of Dragons, correct. True. So I like the fact that you've shared with us your icons or the people that you've looked up to, especially as a woman. Or I hope also that our listeners could research about these wonderful people, these wonderful women, and the characters that you just gave to us are all very interesting. I mean, as an Avenger for Professor Ai and Daenerys for Sumitra. Very interesting characters, and these are not just women, but they are women of substance, women of action. And I also like the fact that all of them also have principles that they lived up to the very end, whether they're fictional or non-fictional, but they stood strong. And on that note, I guess I just want to ask you before we end the program, do you have any last words or messages for our listeners tonight? Anything that you would want to share in relation to, I guess, what we just talked about tonight? We'll start maybe with Professor Oyi.
Okay. This has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you for this opportunity and meeting Sumitra here. Uh, well, I think that young people nowadays sometimes take what they have for granted, and that includes, participating in elections, or just thinking that you have no obligation towards other people, including the women's movement or human rights. Uh, and I always, because I have taught for like 35, I still teach. That I think that one thing that they have to remember, that we all stand on the shoulders of our foremothers and foremothers, and they have written not history, her story for us, and that's because all of these things that we now enjoy came from some women or some groups of women's struggle to gain bit by bit the kind of rights, the kind of freedoms that we all have. But I think although that we have all these privileges and rights, it's never really complete until generations of women that until it's institutionalized. We have some of that. We have progressive laws, but I think the more challenging part of it is educating, as well as raising the consciousness of both men and women. Now we include the men, because without the men also realizing that they have a role to play in the kind of social change that we give, that starts with the individual, that starts with you and me, that starts with the family, the school, and society as a whole, then we can never really achieve real change. So I think every day is a learning process, and that there's such a thing as learning from the young. I'm learning a lot from the young people, but there's also wisdom in listening to elders like myself and others before us. Yeah,
That's
thank
true.
you.
That's true. That's true. Thank you very much, Professor Oyi. And I like the fact that you said that every day we are changing and we are all changing for the better and learning from each other. How about you, Sumitra?
Yeah, so I think what I would like to say to your listeners is, I mean, absolutely, Professor, yeah, you're spot on. So that's,
Yes.
and I also would like to remind us all that we, the peoples of ASEAN, we are the main stakeholders in ASEAN.
Mhm.
Yeah, we have our governments and institutions and so forth, but it's our ASEAN. We are the stakeholders in ASEAN. And if we want to have an ASEAN that is more gender equal, that is more gender diverse and respectful, that enables, equality, that seeks to end violence, that promotes prosperity, it's for us to say it. It's for us to organize. It's for us to move. And you are the main ASEAN stakeholder. And don't forget that. Just
Yeah.
want to
Wow. Wow. Thank you for that, Sumitra. I like that. It just gives us a sense of empowerment that we as stakeholders have the power to do something and to make that change that we want to see in this world, in our region, in our country, or wherever we are. Wow, thank you for that. Thank you so much, Professor Oyi and Sumitra. And on that note, guys, that's all for today's episode of ASEAN People Speak. Thank you all for listening, and thank you to Professor Oyi again and Sumitra for joining me tonight. What do you want to promote your social media accounts, maybe your websites or organizations before we end the program, Sumitra?
Yes.
Sumit,
So, Women's Aid Organization, please visit us. We are online at www.wao.org.my, and our Instagram handle is at Women's Aid Org. Women's Aid Org, one word.
What? Okay. Thank you so much for that, Sumitra. Professor Oyi?
yes, I'd like to invite you to visit our webpage. It's for Wagi, uh, www.https wagi at mc.edu.ph. And we have, some of the articles that we have written, a new framework on feminism, which is entitled "The Future is Female," and
Mm-hmm.
it has lots of video as well. And we have invite our different organizations. Also, we have put the just in time for the 18-day campaign. We have people talking about the idea of violence against women. And we put the declaration of Reykjavik on asserting, I think, strengthening activism against violence against women, and a concert which was done by the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, featuring feminist singers. So
Mm.
it's from New York, but it's fun to listen because you have survivors participating in the program.
Oh, that's nice. That's wonderful, Professor. Join us again next week, guys. Make sure you subscribe also to the podcast on Spotify. This episode will be on Spotify, so you never miss an episode. You could also subscribe to our Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube channel, which is at ASEAN HR Mech. And you can also visit their website, ASEANHRMech.org. Again, this is ASEAN People Speak, and this is your host, Regine Jessica Abuel. Take care, everyone, and stay safe. Good night, everybody. God
Thank
bless.
you.
Night.